Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's event, How China Became Capitalist, a talk with Dr. Ning Wang. The Advocata Institute is delighted to collaborate with the Night Watchman Society to bring you this discussion. I'm Anita Varasvitarana of the Advocata Institute, and before we start, I'd like to give a brief introduction to the Night Watchman Society, our partners for this event. The Night Watchman Society is a meetup group that discusses economic and socio-political topics through a classical liberal lens. They host a monthly meeting alternating between a public discussion and a book club to explore critical ideas related to individual freedom and an open society. The Night Watchman Society also functions as the Bastia chapter in Sri Lanka. So the Night Watchman Society actually discussed Dr. Ning Wang's book this month. So if you are interested in joining this book club, drop a message at info@nightwatchman.org. The email address will be put in the chat box in a few minutes. And before I introduce our speaker for today, I'd also like to mention that today's event is also being live streamed on the pages of the Night Watchman Society Facebook streaming partners, the Advocata Institute, The Morning Business, Sri Lanka Students for Liberty, newshub.lk English, Economy Next, Business News, and citizen.lk. So without further ado, let me give a quick intro to how today's event will run. So we will be starting with a brief talk from Dr. Ning Wang on his book, How China Became Capitalist, that he co-authored with the Nobel laureate Ronald Coase. This talk will be followed by a Q&A session. So, and we want to hear questions from you. So please use the raise hand button that you will see on the bottom of your screen towards the right hand. And if you raise your hand, I'll be able to call on you. You can turn on your camera if you like and ask your question. If you're not comfortable with that, that's fine. Please we still want to hear from you. So drop your question in the chat or in the Q&A or as a Facebook comment, and our team will collate the questions and I will try to take as many as time permits. Until you are called on, please do keep your mic muted throughout the session, just to make sure that audio is as clear as possible for everyone. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Ning Wang is a senior fellow at the Ronald Coase Institute and editor-in-chief of Man and the Economy, Journal of the Coase Society. He has taught at the University of Chicago and Arizona State University, and his main research interests include new institutional economics and China's ongoing market transformation. In 2012, he co-authored How China Became Capitalist with Ronald Coase, which won the 2012 Arthur Selden Award in Excellence, the 2013 Sir Anthony Fisher International Memorial Award, and the 2013 Best Book in Economics from Beijing News. The book is now available in 9 languages, and you can find it basically anywhere books are sold. Dr. Wang received his undergraduate degree from Beijing University and his PhD from the University of Chicago. And we are greatly honored and very excited to have him here with us today. So, Dr. Wang, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining me on this talk about how China became capitalist. I realized that most of you just had a long day at work and you are now taking precious time away from your family and loved ones to join this online event. I also want to thank the Night Watchman Society and the Advocata Institute of Sri Lanka for making this event possible. Today, I'm also aware that the government of Sri Lanka faces a serious payment crisis. And if not properly handled, it may threaten the whole financial system and undermine the vitality of the economy. This is particularly worrisome as the uncertainty of the global pandemic still overshadows our future. And the story I'm going to tell next, I hope will shine some bright light. And indeed, I probably won't be here with you if not for the hope that the story I will tell may help to inform, encourage, and inspire you. But China, at the beginning of its reform, faced a combination of economic and political problems that I believe were much more severe and difficult. So in 1976, the death of Chairman Mao, the founder of the People's Republic, threw China into a deep political crisis. When the Chinese people had already suffered years of starvation, and the Chinese economy at that time was really performing poorly. One indicator was the Chinese GDP per capita at that time was among the lowest in the whole world. That part of the China story, actually, I experienced personally as I was growing up in a village in the 1970s. Finding food to eat during my childhood was a constant struggle, which frequently ended up in disappointment. Now, after 4 decades of economic reform, China had transformed itself beyond anyone's wild expectation. So how did China do it? China's market transformation, as extraordinary as it is not a result of some secret program designed by the Chinese government or prescribed by some experts from the World Bank or anywhere. Indeed, during reform, the Chinese government had no blueprint at all. China's market transformation is an unintended consequence of the Chinese people trying to seek a better life. No one has anticipated China's market transformation. So if there is one single takeaway message from my talk, this is it. But to help you understand the message, I have to give you a few details. My talk is not a substitute for the book, How China Became Capitalist. So if at the end of my talk, you are still intrigued, and I would suggest you go and read the whole book. So let's start with the international environment and the domestic situation when China started reform at the end of 1970s. The world in the late 1970s was still mired in Cold War between the West and the Soviet bloc. So the West welcomed wholeheartedly China's decision to change gear. And it is interesting to note that David Harvey, a British scholar, in his 2005 book, A Short History of Neoliberalism, singled out Deng Xiaoping of China and the American President Reagan and the British Prime Minister Thatcher as responsible for the revival of economic liberalism after the dying out of Keynesian economics in the late 70s. So imagine had Mao lived another decade until, say, Gorbachev started his reform in Soviet Union, I think China's story would play out very differently. Had American presidents from Nixon and Carter to George W. Bush entertained a tiny bit of Trumpism, which sees globalization as detrimental to American interests, I think China's story again would play out differently. And domestically, the Chinese people by late 1970s, by the time Mao died, had been devastated by Mao's economic policy. And not just the Chinese people suffered, even the Chinese leaders realized by that time that Mao's radical policy had failed China with dire economic consequences. So you have to keep in mind that by that time, China had tried 20 years of socialist experiments, but China failed to feed its growing population. At the same time, though, China's neighbors in East Asia had risen from the ashes of World War II and enjoyed rapid economic modernization. So the international community at that time welcomed China's reform, and domestically China was united to start or to restart its search for prosperity. Normally, economic reform in any country often encounters strong resistance from within, and particularly a country as big as China. And if you go back to China's long history, you're going to find a lot of examples that reforms failed. I have in mind, the first reform in the Han Dynasty at the beginning of the first century, to the reform attempted by the Qing Dynasty in the late 19th century. The main challenge that China faced when it started reform was the lack of know-how, technological know-how, and the basic knowledge about the market system. You know how all kinds of markets function. So what did China do at that time? The first thing China did was to go out to and see how other countries run their economy. So in 1979 alone, China sent almost 20 delegations to Hong Kong, to Japan, Singapore, Europe, Canada, the US, almost everywhere, just to see how they run their economy and hopefully to be able to learn from them. And at the same time, China welcomed capitalists from Hong Kong back to China. That, of course, if you are familiar with China's recent history, that's the beginning of what is called the opening of special economic zones in China. And Shenzhen was one of the 4 original economic zones. And it certainly is the most successful one. Now I have to emphasize, this is one aspect of China's market transformation that the outsiders often got it wrong. That is, from the perspective of China, particularly the Chinese leaders, the purpose of reform was not to turn China into a market economy or to turn China into a capitalist society. China, even today, as you know, China claims to be a socialist country. And so that just once again confirmed the message that I singled out at the very beginning, that China's market transformation, that is China's transition from a planned socialist economy to a market economy, is not a designed outcome of any government led reform. what China wanted at that time, I mean, what the Chinese leaders like Deng Xiaoping had in mind at that time was to modernize China's socialist economy. And China at that time adopt whatever methods, whatever ways that help to improve the economy. So I want to bring your attention to a very famous theory of Deng Xiaoping's reform. Nowadays, it's rarely mentioned in China today, but at that time in the 1980s and even 90s, it was very popular. It's called the cat theory, and which basically says, you don't care whether a cat is white or black, as long as it can catch mice. So China was open-minded at that time. They look around, they go to other countries to see how they were, organize or manage the economy, and at the same time, they wanted to modernize its economy in whatever ways that helps to achieve the goal. So that, and Beijing at that time was very clear that they did not have any secret blueprint, any secret method to make this work. So here we have a combination that at one point, so at one end, the Chinese government knew what they wanted to achieve, that is to make China prosperous. But at the same time, they perfectly aware that they didn't know how to do it. So again, to learn from what Hong Kong, what Singapore, what Japan, what the US, what Europe did, that was one thing. Another thing was to let the local governments, let the Chinese people to try to find out how they can get richer, how they can get more prosperous. So as a result of that combination, China wants to get rich, but at the same time, Beijing didn't know what to do. So we had a window of opportunities for local initiatives. That in our book, we call the rise of marginal revolution. That is, during China's reform period, and even today, Beijing government designed one reform after another. There's no doubt about that. You go back to China's to the Chinese government, or to read the People's Daily, that's the official newspaper of Chinese government. You find waves of reforms designed by Beijing trying to push China's economy forward. No doubt about that. So, but that's not the whole. Well, in the beginning, that's not make the Chinese economy actually work. What really make the Chinese economy work, particularly in the 80s, in the 90s, are what we call the marginal revolutions. That is, programs or methods of reform that coming out of grassroots initiatives. One good example is the reform in Chinese agriculture. That is, as you know, before the reform, the agriculture was collectivized during Mao's time. So we had collective farming during Mao's time. But now we realized, Mao's collective farming failed to feed the Chinese growing Chinese population. But as I mentioned, reform was not to teach socialism, right? The reform was meant to modernize, to strengthen socialism. So China did not start by privatizing land. Instead, China tried something is called private farming. That is, farmers were allowed to decide what they're going to plant on their field, but the land stayed as state or collective property. And that is still true today, that farming land still belonged to local collectives. So land was not, even today is not a private property, but peasants gained more and more autonomy in deciding what they can do with the land. And so this is called private farming because, collective farming, people realized didn't work. And of course, before socialist revolution, private farming, China had a private farming for 2000 years. So once Mao died and the collective farming very quickly replaced by private farming, that is, farmers just went back to the old way of doing their business, which turned out to be much better than collective farming. And so private farming started in a few places in China at that time after Mao died, without the permission from Beijing. As I said, Beijing still stick to socialism, and under socialism, every economic activities had to be organized by the state, by the collectives. But quickly, private farming turned out to be far more productive than collective farming. So it began as a secret, as an illegal practice, private farming. But as it turned out to be superior to collective farming, so local governments started to embrace private farming, and they started to persuade Beijing to allow private farming. And after that didn't come easily. And as Beijing at that time still stick to socialism, and particularly because of Mao's legacy, Mao thought, once you allow private farming, socialism is going to collapse in China. And, Mao was right. Once private farming was allowed, gradually, allowed in a few places, its superiority to collective farming was so clear that everyone else tried to, embrace private farming. So private farming quickly spread out to the rest of, rural area. And Beijing at that time was wise enough to decide that to adopt private farming as national policy. And in the window of less than 2 years, collective farming, the commune system was gone, and private farming, of course, at that time it was called household responsibility system, was installed as national policy. So in this case nicely illustrates the nature of Chinese reform. So private farming as a practice started by farmers themselves, and they just trying to, produce enough food to feed them. And first, the local government realized the superiority of private farming to collective farming, and they sided with the peasants and bargaining and talking with Beijing, and finally convinced Beijing that's the way to make China prosperous. And quickly Beijing adopted that practice, which had already proved to work better, and quickly you have a national policy which buried Mao's collective farming and agriculture. Since then, totally changed its face. And since then, you had one harvest after another, and China now, food security is no longer a problem that China used to have constantly during Mao's time. I could go on give you another examples. Private enterprises in the cities, but because of time limit, I will not go into details. But you're welcome to again to go back to the book and find the details. So during reform, many of those practices that worked in China started in local areas by peasants, by local governments, and so on. And Beijing was quickly to recognize their effectiveness and adopt those practices into policy, and advocated that proven methods as national policy, and that helped to modernize the Chinese economy. But one method or one reform after another, China quickly realized that the Chinese economy was growing out of socialism. And indeed, we have a chapter in the book titled Growing Out of Socialism. So China, at the beginning of the reform, did not want to just throw away socialism. China, as I said, wanted to modernize, to strengthen socialism. But as private farming replacing collective farming, as private enterprises outbidding state enterprises, and Chinese government gradually forced to privatize or to just let go bankrupt state enterprises, Chinese economy gradually growing out of socialism, and it became a market economy. And talking about how capitalist China's market economy is today, there are many indicators. If you look at if you compare China with American economy, for example, here if you read New York Times or even The Economist, which is a very decent journal, but many of their reports about China tend to be misleading. As you know, China tend to be characterized as a state capitalism by by Western media. I think that is a mischaracterization. If you compare China and U.S. economy, you see some features that U.S. economy doesn't have. The presence of state enterprises in China. That's a striking example, and that's one key reason. And of course, another feature, striking feature of the Chinese economy is, after 40 years of reform now, China still run by the Chinese Communist Party. China doesn't have any other political parties, doesn't allow other political parties to exist. So China is still a one single party state. So that two features, one, China still ruled by a communist party. Second, China still has a lot of state-owned enterprises. That led, many observers in the West to characterize China as state capitalism. But this is, as I said, is a mischaracterization, because to compare China with the US is one thing, but really to understand how China comes to where it is today, you have to look at China historically. And if you compare China today with China under Mao, the contrast is clear that the state has been withdrawing itself, not completely, but has been withdrawing itself from the economy. At the beginning of reform, China had no private sector to talk about. There's basically no private sector. Private sector was illegal at the beginning of reform. As I said, private farming was not allowed, and the collective farming and the commune system. That's how agriculture was run under Mao. Today, the whole commune system, as I said, just collapsed, and even though the land was still collective property, but farming was done by private households. And in the urban economy, now more than 90% of new jobs are created by private companies. Of course, if you use other indicators, for example, because the banking sector is still very much controlled by the state, so most state loans or loans from the state-owned banks go to state enterprises. Certainly, some go to very successful private companies, but a lot of state credits still go to state enterprises. So if you use that indicator, you may not see clearly how capitalist, how capitalist the Chinese economy is. But look at employment data. If you look at the labor market, clearly the Chinese economy has become more and more market-driven. Even the stock market, even the financial market, for example, has become more and more market-driven. In the beginning, the stock market it's very, very hard at the beginning for a private enterprise to get listed on China's stock market. Today, more and more Chinese private companies are there listed, public companies. So if we look at the trend, there's no ambiguity that China is becoming more and more market-driven. That being said, there is a big shortcoming or even defect of the Chinese market system. We put that out in our book almost 10 years ago, and I think it's still true today. That is, China now has a very much open and a competitive market for goods. All kinds of goods, including factors of production, capital, labor, particularly labor market is very open, very competitive, and all kinds of consumer goods, of course, is open and competitive, and that's why you have so many products made in China now sold everywhere in the whole world. But the market for ideas. That's a concept used by a lot of legal scholars and Professor Coase himself had an article in the 70s talking about the market for ideas. We borrowed that concept in our book to emphasize the fact that where the Chinese people had more and more economic freedom, but the way they express their ideas, the way ideas are created in China, that process still very much controlled by the state. One indicator is the Chinese universities, for example. In any modern society, universities are the place where new ideas are created, or the main place where new ideas are created. But in China, this is not unique to China. But in China, certainly that's the case. That the universities, the Chinese universities that you have ever heard about, Beijing University, Tsinghua University, so on and so forth, they're all public universities. It's very hard for China. They may have a few private universities there, but they are not in a position to compete freely with public universities. And the media and still very much controlled by the state. So in that sense, China does not have an open market for ideas, and that we think is the most severe shortcoming or defect of the Chinese system. That was the case 10 years ago, and I think it's still true today. So I was told that before my talk, I better finish my talk within like 30 minutes, and so that we can have more time for question and discuss and answer. So let me conclude by saying that before I do that, I still have a few, one or two points I want to emphasize. That's talking about how the West got China wrong. One, as I said, is state capitalism. The other one is also very popular, is this assumption, this implicit assumption that as China gradually modernize the economy, China going to democratize its politics and move closer and closer to some Western country like the United States. So this belief in convergency is commonly held, particularly among scholars in the West. You had, after the fall of Berlin Wall, Fukuyama, American political scientist, talking about the end of history. So the underlying assumption was, and still is, that there is one single best model for capitalism. That we believe is wrong. So in our book, we had a chapter called From Capitalism with capital C to capitalisms with a plural capitalisms. And we think China shows that China, just simply because of its size, its culture, its history, it's impossible for China just to become, some country like America, another or some country like Japan. That's not going to happen. So China is going to be different from other market economies. We today, particularly when confronted with climate change and other environmental challenges, we realize that the diversity in nature is good, and that's how we have a healthy environment. We want to encourage diversity. But when we think about human societies, we somehow think there is one model, one perfect model that fits everyone, fits everywhere. That cannot be true. If diversity works for nature, diversity must work for human societies. So China remains different. This is not only, as I said, inevitable, but is also desirable for everyone. We want China to be different. We want, a different kind of capitalisms or market economies that compete with each other, that make everyone better off. Okay, let me that bring me to the conclusion. So China's story is the story of our time, as Time magazine said. And as my co-author, the late Professor Coase put it, the struggle of China is the struggle of the world. And it's unprecedented in human history that 800 million people uplift themselves from poverty in less than 4 decades. So the escape from poverty is not a narrow corridor, but really an open highway. And I hope this story of China really inform, encourage, and inspire you. But on the other hand, I realize it's unrealistic to expect that after my talk, you can readily pick up some lessons and apply them directly to problems you face in Sri Lanka today. That requires, local knowledge, political determination, and social tolerance, none of which I'm in a position to offer. But from the limited knowledge I have, I think Sri Lanka is well positioned to take advantage of the economic rise of China, close relationships with India, and the strong economic ties with the West to realize the economic potential of its 22 million residents. And I wish you good luck in your pursuit of prosperity, happiness, and freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wang. So without further ado, let's jump into the Q&A, because I think throughout the talk we had a few people sending in questions and we already have a few hands raised. So let's take a few of the people who have raised their hands and then we'll switch to some of the questions that have been sent in. I think Dinesh Kotanathan has had his hand up for a while. I'm just going to give you access to speak. Dinesh, you can unmute and ask your question. Please do leave your camera off for now, because of connectivity issues. Dinesh, the mute button, you will find it on the bottom left hand of your screen. Okay, while we wait for Dinesh, Nandika, would you like to join us and jump in with the question? You will have to unmute. Okay, so while we wait for this technical issue to get sorted out, let's proceed with some of the questions that have been sent in. So we have quite a few questions on the chat. Let's start with one of the first ones. So we have a question asking, how did China's political system help for this transformation, as unlike other democracies, it has a one-party government?
Okay, this is a very, very good question and very hard question, indeed. It has some advantage, but the advantage is not free. It comes with some disadvantage. The advantage is, let me give you an example to illustrate the advantage China has over, say, US. When I first came to America in 93, I went to Chicago. And at that time, Chicago was talking about building a third airport. Because Chicago at that time had 2 airports, Ohio Airport and Midway, and they were not sufficient. There was growing demand. So Chicago at that time was debating to have another airport. Do you know where the third airport is today in Chicago? is still on paper. People still debating it. And in the meantime, China has built, I don't know how many, but certainly hundreds of brand new airports all over China. So that shows the efficiency of the Chinese political system once it decides what to do. So there's not much like negotiation between Democrats and the Republicans. Once the Chinese government is committed to doing something, it can be done and be done quickly. So this is the advantage of the Chinese one-party system. So once the party decided to do something, it can be done and be done quite efficiently. The disadvantage or the risk of that efficient system is among so many goals, so many goals to achieve. What is the process that allow China to select the best, priorities to focus on? This is an economic problem, right? Every individual has their own different, preferences, different resources. So what they're going to do, given so many choices out there, they can, working on improve the port or the railway or the schools, reducing poverty, so on and so forth. Just so many things that a government can do. So that process in China was not run democratically. I'm not saying this is done without any participation from the people. There are many ways for Chinese people getting involved to participate in that political process. But China does not have a channel that say people can directly participate in that process. There are many ways Chinese people can voice their discontent or their dissatisfaction. They can nowadays they can move from one place to another. When they can leave China, as you know, a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs, after they become successful, they choose to leave China to send their children abroad for education and so on and so forth. So there are many ways for Chinese people, certainly more ways. Since under Mao's time, there was none for Chinese people to be part of the political process. But as I said, China still does not allow any opposition political parties. So there's no way to have a party run against the Communist Party. But I'm not trying to defend the Chinese political system, which it has, as I said, has a lot of shortcomings. But you cannot take for granted that democracy is the best way to run a political system, and particularly today, for the young Chinese, kids, college students in particular, they know how American system functions, what doesn't function well, and they see how the Chinese government, another example would be how the two countries handle COVID. So that contrast gives the Chinese people, particularly the young people today, more and more confidence in their own system. That at one hand, that worries me, because that led them to be less critical of the Chinese government, and not to see the problems that the Chinese system faces. And one example would that is Chinese universities, for example. I already mentioned that in my talk. uh, the the professors don't have total control of what they can teach, what textbooks they use in teaching their course. Uh, you cannot have like a first-rate university when its professors don't have the freedom to decide what to teach. And China wants to become innovation driven, and particularly today in this technology war or technology competition with US, China wants its engineers, wants its college students to be innovative. But if the Chinese professors, the Chinese universities don't have that kind of intellectual autonomy or freedom, I mean it's hard for them to compete with America in innovation. So again, back to the original point, the Chinese system has some advantage, which is particularly when China trying to catching up with the West. In that kind of a pursuit, you know exactly where to go, so you can mobilize resources to achieve that goal quickly. But once China stands at the cutting edge, China wants to be innovative, then you have to allow people freedom to explore, to try something new. And in that regard, in that pursuit, the government cannot dictate what to do. Otherwise, that there would be no experimentation. There would be no trial and error based learning. And that is critical for any innovation-driven economy. So I think this, looking forward, this is a big challenge for China.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. And we have another question that kind of follows up on what you were just saying. We have a question coming in asking, how did the Chinese government acquire this state capacity and know how to execute these projects efficiently? For a lot of developing countries, this capacity comes from foreign investment. So how did China do it?
China didn't know how to do it at the beginning. It took a while. This is the importance of education. So at the end of Mao's time, as I said, China was one of the poorest country in the whole world. But in terms of literacy, China was doing pretty good. And during Mao's time, China trained a lot of engineers. And today, of course, this has nothing to do with the Chinese, the party or the government. Chinese people just over their history, they emphasized education as a way to improve to better their lives. So education and the knowledge, they think they emphasize a lot, and they take that as the way individually work as a country to advance themselves. So they're very open-minded, and they learn from the West, not only just from the West, from everywhere. China, when I came to America, as I said, in '93, I think at that time, I think India had the largest, foreign student body in America, and very quickly China became the largest, sending more and more students to America, and everywhere, Canada, Singapore, Europe, Australia, everywhere, to learn, basically know-how. And at the beginning, many of them stayed in the West or in wherever they started. But nowadays, more and more returned to China because China just offers more and more opportunities for them. So you have this, so China in that regard, in this labor market, this knowledge market is very open. And again, of course, China allowed foreign capital to come in and set up their business in only in those special economic zones. And gradually, foreign capital had more and more freedom to decide where to set up their business. And nowadays, you have foreign companies basically all over China, and they, with foreign capital, they bring with them access to markets and also technological know-how, managerial know-how, and that kind of knowledge, not just spread to the private sector, but the Chinese government had to deal with the foreign capital, the foreign companies. So in that, when they interact with foreign capital, they had to learn, how to meet their need. And in that process, they gradually learned, how to manage a modern economy. And in that regard, I have to emphasize that, I don't know whether that happens to any other countries, but the Chinese government sent waves of students to study at Harvard Kennedy School, to study at Singapore's management school, just to learn, how the local government functions, how the central government functions. And when they come back, they compare and they, figure out a better way to improve the Chinese, management system.
So on that same sort of line, Dr. Wang, of how China has taken steps to learn from other countries and bring that knowledge in. Sorry, can I be heard?
Yeah.
Great. So we have a question that kind of builds on what you were just saying. Over the years, what initiatives have been taken by China to address shortcomings or limitations in the market of ideas?
This in the how the market for ideas, to what degree that market for ideas was open or was less open, changed over the course of reform. In the 80s, the market for ideas was very much open, and all kinds of ideas, were allowed to go into China. You had, new Marxism, and of course you had neoliberalism. You have, Keynes on the one hand, you had Milton Friedman, you have Hayek, so on and so forth. So that was a time period when Western ideas, very much all kinds of Western ideas find their channel to enter China. And as I emphasized, that was very helpful for China to that kind of freedom, that kind of intellectual freedom was critical for China, particularly at the local levels, for the Chinese private entrepreneurs to learn the market system, to learn that the market can be better than the state in meeting running the economy. But also it's important for the Chinese leaders to understand that there were more than one way to run socialism. At the beginning of reform, when China wanted to know how the outside world run their economy, as I said, they sent delegations to Europe, to North America, to study how they run the market system. But at the same time, they also sent the delegates to former Yugoslavia, to other socialist countries. Particularly Yugoslavia at that time was regarded as a rebellion of socialist of the Stalinist system. So they wanted to know how Poland, how Hungary run their socialist economy. And there were scholars from those socialist countries invited to China to talk about, their ideas and how their countries run socialism differently from both Beijing and Moscow. So that exposure to different ideas, helped both the Chinese leaders and the people to different sides of ways of doing things. That helped to liberalize their thinking. And gradually that comes to, I think, a shortcoming of this is to some degree is inevitable. That is, when China, find itself doing better than expected in handling the economy, in fighting poverty, and so on and so forth, China gradually thought that it had mastered some kind of secret recipe to develop the economy. In China, it's called the China model. That China has somehow found out this magic, as I said, a blueprint to solve economic problems. But this is a hotly debated academic issue. To what degree China model, if there is a China model, whether it can apply to Africa or other developing countries. And a lot of Chinese economists simply deny there is a single China model. Because if you look at the different regions, the way they develop their economies are quite different. The Pearl Delta River, the Yangtze Delta River, and the inland areas, or even within one province, like Guangdong province, which clearly is one of the richest provinces in China, but different cities within Guangdong, they adopted different models. So that's not a single, like a unified, one homogeneous China model to talk about. It's different areas, different regions, different cities, different counties enjoyed their freedom to try, to have the freedom to try different ways to improve their economy. And that kind of, and they compete with each other. So China, in a sense, becomes a laboratory of many different kinds of economic experiments. And that competition and that freedom, really, that's the key to understand the vitality of Chinese market economy. Not some kind of China model designed by Beijing or by anyone else.
So Dr. Wang, I think we've had a few questions coming in. To everyone who has raised their hands, I think we're having some technical issues with unmuting. So please please drop your question in the chat box, and that would be very helpful. But unfortunately, I think we are running out of time. So I think there's just one question that we can close with. Dr. Wang, what is your prognosis for the future? Can China continue to be a non-democratic state? The participant who sent in the question is concerned about the lack of participation of people and whether it can lead to difficulties in the future when few have power to make decisions without participation from the public.
I could easily spend days or even weeks talking about that, answering that question. But again, a great question. You cannot just simply say, for one thing, China is not a democracy. That's for sure. Particularly if democracy is conventionally understood as competing political parties, they win through regular voting, that allow one party to win and to run the system, to run the country. So this, if that's the kind of democracy we think about, China's system is not a democracy. So what exactly is democracy? That's one way to understand the democracy. Democracy in terms of party competition. Very famous, and which is one of my favorite philosophers, Karl Popper. He wrote the book Open Society. He defined democracy simply as a country has democracy or not. He says depends on whether its people can change their leaders peacefully. If a country can peacefully change their leader, he would say they have democracy. So if we adapt this criteria of Popper's criteria, then you cannot deny that China over the past 40 years of reform, they changed their political leaders several times peacefully, right? Whether that process is dictated by popular votes, which today is regarded as the essential feature of democracy, is a different issue. And we can debate, particularly today, and in America now is a hard issue. A lot of American voters are not happy with the way the voting system works here. They want to improve the system. And also, to what degree the political leaders selected by this kind of a democratic system really deliver what they promised during political campaigns. So the question is not whether China is going to become a democratic country in that sense, but whether the Chinese political system can evolve over time that allow people more and more participation in the way the country is run, in the economy, in politics, in every aspect of public life. That is the key, and is everything. I think that every Chinese people demand to have more say in how their lives is run today. And Chinese people get more and more educated, more and more informed about democracy in the world. They have better and better knowledge what's wrong with the Chinese system and what is advantage, what is disadvantage. And if they don't like the Chinese system at all, they could choose to immigrate, to migrate to other countries. But nowadays, as I said, a lot of Chinese students, once they finish their degree in the West, more and more of them choose to go back to China. That is an indicator that they are confident, they are comfortable with the Chinese system. I'm not saying that the Chinese system by no means is perfect. It's not. But whether that system can give people the hope that the system going to change for the better, and for the better in the sense that allow them more and more, give them more and more, not just freedom in terms of how to run the system. This is a very old Chinese idea that meritocracy. China, if you go back centuries, China never believed that everyone should have equal say in running public affairs. China always believed that the sages, that is the educated people, the good people, should have more weight in deciding how the society is run. So that system, that meritocratic system, has been working in China for centuries, long before the Chinese Communist Party took power. And I won't expect that system, that mentality going to disappear anytime soon. And today in the West, there is this debate ongoing about meritocracy over versus democracy. Which system is better? I think a better way is to somehow combine this democracy based on, everyone should be equal, and this idea of meritocracy, because, our modern society is very complex. It's difficult to run. It's not the case that everyone should give equal weight in deciding how to run the economy. You have experts. You should, people with expertise, with proven expertise, should have more to say in running the economy or whatever aspect of the society. So a better way to to run any modern country is not to believe in one single model that we think we already have in hand, like democracy in the West or Chinese Communist Party in China. The democracy has proved to be a very efficient and a very useful tool to liberalize not just the economy, the market forces, but to allow more participation in the economy, in the political process in the West. No doubt about that. But whether democracy is the best, the perfect way, I very much doubt that. And I'm pretty sure the Chinese people, they know the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party has done a good job in the past. No doubt about that. And that's why, Chinese government, despite the fact that there was no democracy and they were not chosen by the people, they felt they have legitimacy to run the country. No doubt about that. But this system itself has problems, as I said. But as China becomes more and more innovation driven, it has to try to run the economy differently, to give people more freedom and to have more freedom itself, of course, is a difficult concept. Freedom does not allow you. Freedom doesn't give you the right to do what pleases you as an individual. Even though we, tend to conceptualize or tend to think individuals in that way, but freedom comes with a very heavy price tag. Freedom comes with tolerance, at least tolerance. That is, when you pursue your freedom, you have to allow other people to pursue their freedom in ways that you don't like. So tolerance is critically important for any modern society, for any society that want to be pluralistic, to sustain as an open society. You have to allow people have to be tolerant to different ideas, not just being different, but ideas that you don't like, or even ideas you hate. You cannot just act according to your instincts. This is bad behavior. This is against my religion. I have to oppress it. You have to learn to learn to be tolerant, to treat people the way you want to be treated. If you want to pursue freedom, you have to allow other people you don't like, the same right to pursue their freedom. That kind of attitude, I think, is important not only for China, but for any modern society.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. I know I said that was the last question, but do you think we could keep you for another 10 minutes? Because we have gotten a lot more questions in, and I think I would.
That's fine with me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So we've had a few questions in coming in on the topic of state-owned enterprises. So I'll combine them so that it's a little easier. So the audience wants to know about the public quoted company shareholding mechanism in China. What is the type that the government owns, and can the private sector own a majority shareholding? How do foreign investments into these companies work? Like, are they allowed to own a percentage of shares? So basically trying to understand how the public quoted companies work. And then the second second question that came in was that about 90% or over 90% of jobs created in the Chinese economy are by this private sector, but these are essentially semi-government companies and therefore aren't 100% private. And is this the case? Is this kind of summary of the questions that have come in?
Okay, the second question first.
Sure.
I don't understand. The question, I said in my talk that over 90% of new jobs are created by private companies. This is purely private companies. I'm not talking about the quasi-state companies or government jobs. Government jobs still very popular among college graduates. And China, to be able to qualify for any state job, you had to pass a national exam. That exam is very, very competitive. Sometimes you have like 1,000 candidates for one job. Part of the reason was this kind of a government job, it comes with some kind of prestige, and also it comes with security. But as I said, they only create, so if private company is responsible for 90% of new jobs, the state sector and the government jobs only counted for 10% of new jobs. So this is pretty clear. The labor market is driven by market forces in China. The first question about public companies, that the companies listed in Chinese stock market, either Shanghai or Shenzhen. To my knowledge, if it's a private company, then the stocks, can be purchased openly, in through the stock market. Even foreigners are allowed to purchase, but whether there is any limitation, so how much you can buy, I'm not sure. I wouldn't be surprised if there is like a limit that you say you cannot. I don't know. Of course, all of those companies listed on the stock market, they are big, so you need a lot of money to be able to by a significant percentage of the shares in the market. But for the state companies, I know for the you probably can buy shares, but those shares don't give you the right to vote. So the Chinese companies have, this is non-voting shares, you can, if they have profits to distribute, and you are entitled, but you are not, you don't have the rights to vote in terms of the managerial issues. And of course, how the public companies are run and are regulated, that change very quickly over time. So I don't have the updated version of the regulation.
Dr. Wang, right now, when you think of China, it's almost the next word that comes to your mind is the Belt and Road Initiative, especially here in China, in Sri Lanka. So how do you see this expansion of Chinese influence and investment through the Belt and Road Initiative and the increasing role across the world?
Well, someone here, I'm quite positive about this. It's called RCI initiative, Road and Belt initiative. For a number of reasons. One, competition is we need competition, particularly in developing countries. Developing countries, I'll give you one example. Today, if you here in America, the interest rate is almost zero. So government borrow money because the Fed can just print money, right? So the American government can borrow money at zero interest rate. Sri Lanka now has a debt crisis. Certainly means you have a debt crisis because you have to pay interest for the debt you borrowed. And I don't know the exact interest rate, maybe 5% or maybe even higher. So you have in the world, you have the richest country, which the government can borrow at zero interest rate. And a developing country has to pay penalized by high interest rate. That's when we're talking about justice, when we're talking about fairness, this is injustice, this is unfair. So that China is able to enter this market for credits, for loans, I think is good for everyone. Previously, you had the World Bank or IMF or Asian Development Bank. They, other than the state loans, in terms of international bodies, they are the only places you have to go if you want to borrow money. Now China's entered the stage. I think at least it's a different player. It has plays by different rules. That itself has attracted a lot of criticism because China does not play by the international rules. China, for example, does not for World Bank, for example. If you want to get money from World Bank, they will give you certain preconditions. You have to meet those conditions before you can get your loan. China doesn't do that. China gives you it's not that China gives you just money for free, but you have to show the Chinese government somehow that we're going to say modernize this port or build a railway between the capital and some other cities. And then China assume that China going to send a team to evaluate that the project and decide how much the project is going to cost and the long-term economic benefits of that project, and then decide how much you can borrow from China. But China does not requires the macro reforms that you have to cut down on spending, you have to control your inflation. China does not engage in that kind of macroeconomic management. I see some irony here. China is not a democracy; it's an autocratic country, right? But China does not dictate what you should do to get money. As long as you use the money to build that port, you are fine. China does not require you, to reform your macroeconomy, to reform your financial system, so on and so forth, before you can get the loan. Instead, the World Bank is a country of, represents the West, represents democratic countries. They specify preconditions, and those preconditions often are met with resistance from the people, because one very common precondition is, the country has to, say, control inflation, and that means cut down of public expenditure on welfare programs, and so on and so forth. And those programs, the cut of those programs, going to hurt the local people. So that China runs the Belt Initiative in its own rule, with its own rules, I think is good, and that gives people more choices, right? So Sri Lanka, you can borrow money from World Bank, or Asia Development Bank, or from Asia, or from China. I think as far as the consumer is concerned, better choice is always, not in all cases, but in most cases, more choice is better as far as consumer is concerned. So from the Chinese perspective, whether that kind of initiative is sustainable, there is one data showing that by year 2025, China would have to spend $1.2 trillion on those projects. And those projects now, we don't know the exact number of those projects, but those projects are unfolding in more than 100 countries all over the world. So this initiative comes with a huge price tag, over $1 trillion. Can China sustain that kind of lending? Well, this is a open question. Of course, if the Chinese economy keeps growing, that's no doubt, this kind of lending is sustainable. But let me give you another example, another data, another number, and then you will understand better why China is willing to spend $1 trillion on this, Belt and Road Initiative. U.S. in the past decade spent close to $1 trillion just on the war in Afghanistan. So you have U.S. spent $1 trillion on the war, just the war in Afghanistan. And you have China spending more than $1 trillion by 2030 on ports, highways, infrastructure, in other countries. I think the contrast cannot be more striking. And it's easier for people to choose one over the other, right? So I don't need to go much further to talking about why this Belt and Road Initiative is good as far as the boring countries are concerned.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wang. And with that, I think we will close today's session. I'd like to thank the Night Watchman Society Facebook streaming partners, the Advocata Institute, the Morning Business, Sri Lanka Students for Liberty, News Hub LK English, Economy Next, Business News, and Citizen.lk. If anyone is interested in joining the book club that the Night Watchman Society runs, this happens every other month. The email is in the chat box. Please do send them, drop a message to the Night Watchman Society on that email, and they will reach out to you and add you to the book club, where we discuss books such as Dr. Wang's How China Became Capitalist, And Dr. Wang, thank you so much for joining us today and taking the time and waking up very early for us. It is much appreciated. It was a pleasure having you, and the discussion was really very, very interesting.
Pleasure is always mine. Thank you.
Thanks. To everyone watching, thank you so much for joining and participating in today's discussion. If you would like to be a part of more events like this, do follow the Night Watchman Society on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and also follow the Advocata Institute on the same channels. Thank you. Have a good evening.